The northbound express wheezed to a stop at Blackmoor Depot, its iron belly groaning against the bitter wind that cut through the mountains like a blade. Snow swirled across the empty platform as passengers hurried into the warmth, leaving behind only footprints and the faint echo of closing doors. Princess Ilara Winterbourne pressed herself against the depot's stone wall, her royal silks now torn rags that offered no protection against the killing cold. 3 days of running had drained everything from her, strength, hope, and nearly her life. The marriage contract to the tyrant prince lay heavy in her coat pocket, unsigned and worthless. If they found her now, war would consume both kingdoms. "I'm freezing," she whispered to the empty night, her breath forming crystals that fell like tears. Heavy boots crunched through the snow. Captain Marcus Kane emerged from the shadows, his hand resting on his sword hilt. For 12 years, he'd served as her father's most trusted guard. Now he'd been sent to drag her home to a fate worse than death. But when their eyes met across the frozen platform, everything changed. Instead of drawing his blade, he removed his cloak. "Your Highness." His voice carried no triumph, only something that sounded dangerously like regret. The thick wool cloak settled around her shoulders, still warm from his body heat. "You're shivering." Ilara stared at him, too exhausted to run, too shocked to speak. This man had tracked her across 3 provinces. She'd heard his name whispered in taverns, seen the fear in smugglers' eyes when they spoke of the king's relentless hound. Marcus Kane never failed a mission, never showed mercy. So why was he wrapping his cloak around her instead of binding her wrists? "I know why you ran." His weathered face was unreadable in the moonlight, but his eyes, those storm-grey eyes that had watched over her since childhood, held something she'd never seen before: doubt. Prince Roderick's reputation precedes him. "Then you know I can't go back." Her voice cracked like ice under pressure. "Father may call it diplomacy, but selling your daughter to a monster has another name." Marcus stepped closer, and she caught the scent of leather and steel that had always meant safety in her world. How strange that it still did, even now. "King Aldric believes this marriage will prevent war. Winterbourne needs Valdemir's army. Winterbourne needs a ruler who won't sacrifice his people for political convenience." The words escaped before she could stop them, treason spoken aloud in the howling wind. "I've read the reports, Marcus. I know what Roderick did to his first wife, what he does to anyone who defies him." Something flickered across the captain's features. Pain, perhaps, or recognition of an uncomfortable truth. "Your father thinks you're young, foolish, that you'll see reason once you're home." He paused, studying her face as if memorizing it. "But you're not that little girl who used to hide in the armory anymore." Ilara almost smiled at the memory. She'd been 8, fascinated by the weapons and the stories Marcus told about battles fought in distant lands. He'd been the only adult who didn't speak to her in sugared words and false smiles. "You taught me that a sword is only as strong as the hand that wields it," she said. "That duty without honor is just another word for cowardice." The wind howled between them, carrying the scent of snow and something else. Smoke from the depot's chimney, the promise of warmth and shelter. Marcus glanced toward the building, then back to her, his internal struggle written in the tense line of his shoulders. "There's a southbound train in 2 hours," he said quietly. "Goes to Port Havensreach. From there, ships sail to the free cities." Hope fluttered in her chest like a caged bird testing its wings. "Marcus, I never found you." His hand moved to the leather pouch at his belt, withdrawing a handful of gold coins. "You disappeared in the mountains. No trace. The search continues, but—" He pressed the money into her frozen fingers. "Winter storms can be treacherous. People vanish. They'll know. Someone will tell them you were here. The station master is dead drunk in his office. The porter left with the last train." Marcus stepped back, his expression hardening into the mask she'd seen him wear before the king. "There's no one here but ghosts and shadows." Ilara stared at the gold in her palm, enough to buy passage anywhere in the known world. Freedom had a weight to it, she realized, heavy and light all at once. Why? The question hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. For a moment, Marcus looked older than his 35 years, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour or the bitter cold. "Because some oaths matter more than others," he said. "I swore to protect the crown, but I also swore to protect you." The depot bell chimed once, echoing across the empty platform. The abandoned railway car smelled of rust and old leather, its windows frosted thick enough to blur the world outside into shapeless white. Marcus had carried the princess here after she'd collapsed, her fevered body lighter than he'd expected, as if the cold had already begun claiming pieces of her. Now she lay unconscious on a moth-eaten bench seat, her breathing shallow and ragged. He should have dragged her straight back to the capital, should have bound her hands and thrown her over his horse like cargo. The bounty on Princess Lirale's head could feed a village for a year, and King Aldric had made it clear that failure wasn't an option. But something about the way she'd looked at him in those final moments before fainting, not with fear but with a terrible, resigned understanding, had made his hands refuse to reach for his shackles. Marcus pulled off his heavy cloak and tucked it around her shivering form. Beneath the grime and exhaustion, she was still recognizably the girl from the royal portraits, though thinner now, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her lips had taken on a bluish tint that spoke of too many nights sleeping rough in the winter mountains. "Foolish girl," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if he meant her or himself. Outside, the wind howled through the skeletal remains of the depot, setting loose boards to creaking like ship masts. This branch of the railway had been abandoned for 5 years, ever since the mountain passes became too dangerous for regular travel. Bandits mostly, though rumors spoke of stranger things lurking in the high peaks, things with too many teeth and eyes that reflected starlight. The princess stirred, her eyelids fluttering. When she finally opened them fully, they fixed on him with startling clarity for someone who'd been half dead moments before. "You didn't arrest me." Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Marcus remained standing, one hand resting on his sword hilt. "You collapsed before I could make the decision." A ghost of a smile touched her cracked lips. "Liar. You had plenty of time while I was unconscious." She was right, of course. He'd had nearly an hour to bind her and begin the journey back. Instead, he'd built a small fire in the car's old heating stove and melted snow for water. Acts of kindness that would be seen as treason if discovered. "Why did you run?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Royal Guards weren't supposed to ask why, they were supposed to follow orders. Lirale struggled to sit up, pulling his cloak tighter around her shoulders. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me." For a long moment, she studied his face as if searching for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she sighed and looked toward the frosted windows. "My father isn't planning to crown my brother as heir. He's planning to sell me to the Shadowlands as part of a treaty, a bride gift, to seal an alliance with things that should never be trusted." Her voice grew harder with each word. "I've seen the documents, read the correspondence. Prince Malachar doesn't want a wife. He wants a vessel, something to pour his darkness into until there's nothing left of me but shadow and screaming." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach that had nothing to do with the cold. The Shadowlands had been quiet for 2 decades, their borders sealed by ancient magic. If King Aldric was truly negotiating with them, that's impossible. The treaties are breaking down. Lirale's eyes met his, and he saw truth there, terrible and absolute. The barriers weaken more each year. Father thinks he can buy peace by feeding them a princess. He's wrong. This will only make them stronger. The fire in the stove crackled, sending shadows dancing across the car's walls. Marcus had sworn an oath to serve the crown, to protect the kingdom from all threats. But if what she said was true, then the greatest threat to the realm might be the king himself. "Where were you planning to go?" he asked. "The northern monasteries. They say the monks there remember the old ways, the true magic that could repair the barriers permanently. It's probably a fool's hope, but—" She shrugged. Better to die trying than live as a monster's bride. Marcus weighed his options. Return with the princess and collect his reward, knowing he'd be handing her over to a fate worse than death, or help her escape and become a traitor to everything he'd sworn to protect. The choice should have been simple: duty over heart, crown over conscience. But as he looked at her, this brave, doomed girl who'd risked everything to save a kingdom that wanted her captured, Marcus realized some oaths were worth breaking. "The northern monasteries are 300 miles through hostile territory," he said finally. "You'll never make it alone." Hope flickered in her eyes. But with help? Marcus reached for his sword, and for one heart-stopping moment, Lirali tensed as if expecting the blade. Instead, he unbuckled the scabbard and set it aside. "With help," he said, "we might have a chance." The abandoned railway station offered little shelter from the howling wind that drove snow through every gap in the weathered boards. Kieran had found a storage room in the back, where broken crates and rusted tools lay forgotten, creating a makeshift windbreak around an old pot-bellied stove that mercifully still functioned. The princess, Lirali, he reminded himself, though using her name felt like crossing another line, lay unconscious on his heavy cloak, her breathing shallow but steady. He fed another piece of splintered wood into the stove and studied her pale face in the flickering orange light. Even unconscious and half-frozen, she possessed an otherworldly beauty that made his chest tighten. Her silver hair had dried to reveal its true luminescence, seeming to glow with its own inner light. Dark lashes cast shadows on her sharp cheekbones, and her lips held a faint blue tinge that worried him despite the growing warmth in the small space. What was he doing? Every oath he'd sworn demanded he bind her hands, wake her, and drag her back to face whatever judgment awaited. The kingdom needed stability. The nobles were already circling like vultures, using her disappearance to question the royal bloodline's fitness to rule. Some whispered that her father's mysterious illness was divine punishment for harboring a child touched by wild magic. Kieran's jaw clenched at the memory of those conversations, the way certain lords' eyes gleamed when they spoke of necessary changes and new leadership. He'd stood silent in shadowed corners, playing the role of the loyal guard while bile rose in his throat. A soft whimper drew his attention back to Lirali. She stirred, silver brows drawing together as if caught in an unpleasant dream. Her lips moved soundlessly, and frost began forming on the wooden crate beside her head. "No," she whispered, voice thick with sleep and anguish. "Please, I can't control it. I can't." The temperature in the room plummeted. Kieran's breath misted as ice crystals spread across the walls with spiderweb delicacy. The very air seemed to crystallize around her, beautiful and terrifying. He'd heard rumors of her power, whispered stories from servants about frozen gardens and rooms that turned to winter at her touch. But seeing it, feeling the raw magic roll off her in waves, made his heart race with something between fear and wonder. "Lirali," he kept his voice gentle, moving slowly to kneel beside her. "You're safe. It's just a dream." Her eyes snapped open, silver as moonlight and wild with panic. The magical cold intensified, ice crawling up his sleeves. But Kieran didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out, covering her trembling hand with his own. The ice burned like fire where it touched his skin, but he held on, meeting her frightened gaze steadily. "Breathe, you're safe." "You don't understand." Her voice cracked. "I'm not safe. I'm never safe. Everything I touch turns to winter. Everyone I care about gets hurt." Tears tracked down her cheeks, freezing before they could fall. "That's why I had to leave. That's why I can never go back." The arranged marriage. It wasn't a question. He'd been there when the delegation from the southern kingdoms arrived, had seen their prince's calculating eyes, and heard the whispered negotiations about containing the curse and preventing contamination of future heirs. She flinched as if struck. "They want to lock me away. A pretty prison with golden bars, but a prison nonetheless. Marriage to a man who looks at me like I'm a disease to be cured." Her hand twisted under his, but he held firm despite the spreading numbness in his fingers. And if I refuse, if I stay, the nobles will use my power as an excuse to remove father from the throne. They're already saying the royal line is cursed. The bitter truth in her words cut deep. Kieran had witnessed those same political machinations, seen how quickly loyalty crumbled when power was at stake. So you chose exile over surrender. I chose freedom over fear. The ice around them began to recede as her breathing steadied, though I'm not sure there's really a difference. Kieran felt the warmth returning to his hand as her magic settled, but he didn't release her. This close, he could see flecks of blue in her silver eyes, like chips of winter sky. There's always a third choice. Is there? Her laugh held no humor. Tell me, Captain Thorn, what choice does a princess with cursed magic have when the whole world wants to either cage her or use her? The way she said his name, like a prayer and a challenge combined, made his decision for him. Later, he would tell himself it was strategy, that someone with her power could be valuable in the coming political storm. But in that moment, with ice crystals melting around them and her hand warming under his, Kieran knew he was lying to himself. She could disappear, he said quietly. If someone helped her reach the northern territories beyond the kingdom's reach, she might find a new life entirely. Hope flickered in her eyes before doubt chased it away. You would do that? Risk everything to help me escape? Kieran's thumb traced across her knuckles, already knowing he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. I would. The safe house sat nestled between two abandoned warehouses on the outskirts of Millhaven, its weathered brick facade blending seamlessly with the industrial decay surrounding it. Kyle carried Lyra through the narrow alley, her breathing shallow but steady against his chest. Each step felt like crossing an invisible line, pulling him further from the oath he'd sworn and deeper into uncharted territory. Inside, the house revealed itself to be far more comfortable than its exterior suggested. Warm lamplight cast golden shadows across worn but clean furniture, and a fire crackled in the hearth. Kale had used this place twice before during extended missions, but never for harboring fugitives, never for treason. He settled Lyra onto the small bed in the back room, her dark hair spilling across the pillow like ink on parchment. The fever had broken during their journey, but exhaustion still painted dark circles beneath her eyes. As he pulled a quilt over her sleeping form, she stirred slightly, her fingers unconsciously, reaching for something that wasn't there. The pendant, she whispered, her eyes fluttering open. Did you? Safe, Kyle assured her, producing the silver chain from his pocket. The pendant caught the lamplight, its surface etched with the ancient seal of Valdris. Though I should ask why you're carrying a fake. Lyra's laugh held no humor. Because the real one would have gotten me killed before I made it past the palace gates. She struggled to sit up, accepting the pendant with trembling fingers. This belonged to my grandmother. The real crown seal is complicated. Kyle settled into the chair beside the bed, studying her face. Away from the harsh lighting of the depot, she looked younger, more vulnerable. But there was steel in her green eyes, a determination that reminded him why she'd earned her reputation as the most stubborn member of the royal family. Why run? The question escaped before he could stop it. Your father is dying, Lyra. The kingdom needs truth, not another puppet monarch. Fire blazed in her voice despite her weakened state. Do you know what they plan to announce at my coronation? A marriage contract. To Prince Aldrich of Corvan. Kyle's blood turned cold. Corvan had been pressing territorial claims against Valdris for months, their armies gathering at the eastern border like storm clouds. A marriage alliance would essentially hand them the kingdom without a single battle. The Privy Council, he said quietly. They're behind this. Lord Voss leads them, but they're all complicit. Lyra's fingers tightened around the pendant. They think a weak queen married to a foreign prince will be easier to control than my father ever was. They're probably right. So you ran to avoid marriage? Kyle couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. There had to be another way. I ran to find allies. The steel in her voice sharpened to a blade's edge. There are loyalists in the northern provinces, nobles who remember what Valdris was before the council consolidated power. If I can reach them, gather support. You're talking about civil war. I'm talking about saving my kingdom from being sold to the highest bidder. Lyra swung her legs over the side of the bed, though the effort clearly cost her. Corvin won't stop at marriage, Kyle. They'll absorb us completely within a generation. Kyle had seen the intelligence reports. Corvin's expansion into neighboring territories followed a predictable pattern: political marriage, gradual integration, eventual annexation. But starting a rebellion would tear Valdris apart from within, potentially leaving them vulnerable to other threats. And if you're wrong, he asked, if the northern nobles won't support you, if the people choose stability over uncertainty? For a moment, doubt flickered across her features. Then she lifted her chin with familiar royal stubbornness. Then at least I'll have tried. At least I won't have handed them my kingdom without a fight. Outside, wind rattled the windows, carrying the promise of another storm. Kyle found himself at a crossroads he'd never imagined facing. His duty was clear: return the princess to the capital, let the Privy Council sort out the political complications. But sitting here, listening to her speak of loyalty and sacrifice, he remembered why he'd sworn his oath in the first place. Not to the council, to the crown, to Valdris itself. The northern pass through the Thornwood Mountains, he said slowly. It's treacherous this time of year, but it would get you to Lord Garrett's territory undetected. Hope sparked in Lyra's eyes. You know another way? I know several ways. Kyle stood, decision crystallizing in his chest like ice. The question is whether you're strong enough to travel. We'd need to leave before dawn. We? The word hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Kyle met her gaze steadily. I swore to protect the crown of Valdris, Your Highness. It seems the crown needs protecting from more enemies than I originally thought. The abandoned watchtower stood like a skeletal finger against the storm-darkened sky, its crumbling stones offering the only shelter for miles. Kyle kicked open the warped wooden door, shouldering through with Lyra still unconscious in his arms. Snow swirled through gaps in the walls, but the structure blocked the worst of the wind's bite. He lowered her carefully onto a pile of moth-eaten blankets someone had left behind. Smugglers, most likely, or other travelers caught by the mountain's unpredictable weather. Her breathing remained shallow, lips still tinged with blue despite the cloak wrapped around her. Kyle stripped off his leather gloves and pressed his fingers to her throat, feeling for the flutter of her pulse. Too weak, too slow. Come on, princess, he muttered, shrugging out of his heavy coat. Don't die on me now. Not after all this trouble. He gathered what dry wood he could find scattered around the tower's base and coaxed a small fire to life in the ancient hearth. The flames cast dancing shadows across Lyra's pale face, making her look even more fragile than before. As warmth began to fill the small space, Kyle allowed himself to truly examine her for the first time since the depot. Gone was the perfectly coiffed princess from the palace portraits. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves, streaked with melting snow. Her traveling clothes, a simple wool dress and worn boots, spoke of careful planning rather than impulsive flight. This hadn't been a moment's rebellion. She'd been preparing to run. Why? He asked the unconscious girl. What could be worth throwing away a crown? As if summoned by his question, she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing those distinctive violet eyes that marked her as true royal blood. For a moment, confusion clouded her features as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. You, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Recognition dawned, followed immediately by wariness. She struggled to sit up, then winced as the movement sent tremors through her weakened body. Easy. Kyle raised his hands, showing empty palms. You collapsed at the depot. Hypothermia. Lyra's gaze darted to the door, calculating distance, odds of escape. Even half-frozen and exhausted, she was already planning her next move. Kyle found himself grudgingly impressed. The storm's too strong, he said, following her thoughts. We're stuck here until it passes. And then you drag me back in chains." Her chin lifted with the same defiance he'd witnessed at the train platform. "I suppose you're already composing your report for my father." Kyle was quiet for a long moment, feeding another branch to the fire. The wood crackled and hissed, filling the silence between them. When he finally spoke, his words surprised them both. "Depends. On what?" "On why you ran." He turned to face her fully, those steel-grey eyes holding hers captive. "The Princess Lyra I've been guarding for 3 years wouldn't abandon her people without good reason. So what reason was good enough?" Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the careful mask she wore. For an instant he glimpsed the frightened girl beneath the royal composure. "You wouldn't understand," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Try me." Lyra pulled his cloak tighter around her shoulders, using the movement to break eye contact. A loyal guard of the crown doesn't question royal decisions. Maybe not, but a man protecting someone he... Kyle stopped himself before the words could fully form. The admission hung unfinished between them, dangerous as any blade. Her eyes snapped back to his. "Someone you what?" The fire popped, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, shaking the tower's ancient bones. Kyle had faced enemy swords, political intrigue, and assassination attempts without flinching. But the weight of Lyra's gaze stripped him bare. "Someone I care about," he finished quietly. The words settled between them like fresh snow, pristine and transformative. Lyra stared at him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Not just the silent shadow who'd trailed her through palace corridors, but the man who'd chosen to carry her to safety rather than drag her home. "Kyle," she began, his name soft on her lips. "My father means to marry me to Prince Aldrich of Morvain." Understanding hit him like a physical blow. Prince Aldrich, brutal, twice her age, with a reputation for cruelty toward his wives. The political alliance would strengthen Etheria's borders, but at a cost that made Kyle's jaw clench. "The contract was signed yesterday," Lyra continued. "The wedding is set for spring. I couldn't," her voice broke. "I won't become another of his victims." In that moment, Kyle understood that his choice at the depot had been no choice at all. Duty demanded he return her to face her fate. Honor demanded he protect her from it. Sometimes, he was learning, the two couldn't coexist. The safe house perched on the mountainside like a forgotten prayer, its weathered stone walls camouflaged against the granite cliffs. Marcus had discovered it years ago during a training expedition, a shepherd's abandoned refuge that had become his secret sanctuary whenever the weight of his captain's medallion grew too heavy. Now, as he guided the stolen horse up the treacherous path with Lyrali unconscious in his arms, he prayed to every god he could name that his haven would hold. Snow began falling again as they reached the wooden door, fat flakes that would cover their tracks within the hour. Marcus kicked the door open and carried Lyrali inside, her breathing still shallow but more regular than it had been at the depot. The single room was sparse, a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and a bed that had seen better decades. But it was warm, dry, and most importantly, invisible to the world below. He laid her gently on the bed, then set about building a fire. The familiar motions of kindling and flame gave his hands something to do while his mind raced through the magnitude of what he'd done. By now, Lieutenant Garrett would have returned to the capital with news of his defection. The king would be apoplectic. His fellow guards would be questioning everything they thought they knew about their captain. And somewhere in the palace, his sister would be weeping into her hands, knowing that her brother had thrown away everything their family had worked to achieve. The fire caught, casting dancing shadows across Lyrali's pale features. In sleep, she looked younger somehow. The determined set of her jaw softened into something almost vulnerable. Marcus found himself studying the curve of her cheek, the way her dark hair spilled across the pillow like spilled ink. When had she stopped being simply his duty and became this? A groan from the bed snapped him back to reality. Lyrali's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. She tried to sit up too quickly and immediately pressed a hand to her temple. "Easy," Marcus said, moving to her side. "You've been unconscious for hours." Her gaze sharpened as memory returned. "You're the guard, the one from the depot." Her voice held a mixture of wariness and something else, gratitude perhaps, though she seemed reluctant to admit it. "Captain Marcus Thorne," he said formally, then caught himself. "Though I suppose rank matters little now. You helped me escape." It wasn't a question, but her tone suggested she still couldn't quite believe it. Marcus settled into the chair beside the bed, suddenly exhausted. "I made a choice. Whether it was the right one remains to be seen." Lirali pushed herself up against the headboard, wincing. "Why? You had me. Your duty was clear." The question he'd been dreading hung in the air between them. Marcus stared into the fire, watching the flames consume the wood with ruthless efficiency. "Because I've spent 5 years watching your father's paranoia poison everything it touches. Because I've seen what his fear does to innocent people. And because," he met her eyes, "because someone who fights that hard for freedom deserves the chance to find it." Something shifted in her expression, surprise giving way to a cautious hope. "You don't know what I've done, what I'm planning to do. Then tell me." For a long moment, only the crackling fire filled the silence. When Lirali finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm going to the consortium. The merchant coalition in the eastern provinces has been secretly organizing. They want to establish a constitutional monarchy, limit the crown's power. My father doesn't know how far their influence has spread." She looked at him directly. "If I can reach them, if I can legitimize their cause by supporting it, you'll start a civil war," Marcus finished. "Or prevent one. The kingdom is already fracturing, Marcus. You must see that. The nobles grow restless, the common folk suffer under impossible taxes, and my father responds to every criticism with increasingly harsh measures." Her hands clenched in the blanket. "Change is coming whether he accepts it or not. The only question is whether it comes through reform or revolution." Marcus absorbed this, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The increased patrols in the eastern provinces, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered rooms, the way certain lords had begun avoiding court altogether. "The consortium is 3 days' hard ride from here," he said slowly, "through territory crawling with your father's men. I know the risks." "Do you?" He leaned forward. "Because by helping you, I've made myself a traitor. If we're caught, it's not just exile we'll face, it's the executioner's block." Their eyes met across the small space, and Marcus felt something fundamental shift between them. No longer hunter and prey, not quite allies, but something undefined and dangerous. Lirali's chin lifted with familiar royal determination. "Then we'd better not get caught." Outside, the wind howled through the mountain passes, and the snow continued to fall. The abandoned hunting lodge sat like a forgotten memory against the mountainside, its weathered timber walls barely visible through the swirling snow. Kyle kicked open the warped door, his arms burning from carrying Lyra through the deepening drifts. The interior smelled of old wood and mice, but it was mercifully dry. He laid her gently on a dusty couch near the stone fireplace, her breathing still shallow but steady. The fever had broken sometime during their arduous climb, but she remained unconscious, her face pale as the snow that clung to her dark hair. Kyle worked quickly, gathering kindling from a pile of broken furniture. His hands shook as he struck flint to tinder, not from cold, but from the weight of what he'd done. By now, Captain Aldrich would have discovered his absence. Search parties would be forming, his name would be spoken with disgust in the barracks where he'd once been respected. The fire caught, casting dancing shadows across the small room. He turned to find Lyra's eyes open, watching him with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper he couldn't name. "You came back for me," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You collapsed. I couldn't just—" "You could have. You should have." She struggled to sit up, wincing. "Do you understand what you've done? What this means for you?" Kyle knelt beside the couch, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. I understand that leaving you to die in the snow would have been the end of everything I believed myself to be, even if it means being branded a traitor. Even then, the wind howled outside, rattling the lodge's windows. Lyra studied his face in the firelight, searching for something. Why, Kyle? Why throw away everything for someone you barely know? The question hung between them like a sword. He'd been asking himself the same thing since the moment he'd chosen to help her rather than fulfill his duty. The answer terrified him with its simplicity. Because in 3 days, you've shown me more truth than I've seen in 10 years of service, he said quietly. Because when you spoke about your father's corruption, about the people suffering while nobles feast, I recognized the kingdom I swore to protect, not the one I've been serving. Lyra's eyes glistened. You don't know what you're saying. The things I've discovered, the secrets I carry, they're dangerous beyond measure. If certain people knew what I found in my father's study, then tell me. She shook her head. I can't ask you to bear that burden. You're not asking. I'm choosing. He reached for her hand, surprised by its warmth. We've already crossed the line, Lyra. There's no going back for either of us now. For a long moment she was silent. Then, with visible effort, she pulled a small leather journal from inside her coat. The binding was cracked, the pages yellowed with age. This belonged to my mother, she said. I found it hidden in a secret compartment of Father's desk. It contains records of his dealings with the Shadowlands, payments, agreements, promises of territory in exchange for their support in maintaining his throne. Kyle's blood turned to ice. The Shadowlands were the kingdom's ancestral enemy, a realm of dark magic and twisted creatures that had been held at bay for generations. That's impossible. King Aldwin would never... Wouldn't he? Look. She opened the journal, revealing pages covered in her mother's delicate handwriting. She discovered it all before she died. The raids on border villages, they're not random attacks. They're coordinated strikes to keep the people afraid, dependent on Father's protection. He's been feeding information to Shadow Lords about our defenses, allowing just enough chaos to justify his increasingly harsh rule. The words swam before Kyle's eyes. If this was true, everything he'd fought for, everyone he'd lost in battles against shadow creatures, it had all been orchestrated by the very man he'd sworn to serve. My mother was going to expose him, Lyra continued, her voice breaking. The fever that killed her, I don't think it was natural, and when I started asking questions, showing interest in her old belongings, she met his gaze. Why do you think he was so eager to have me married off to Lord Aldrich? His nephew has similar arrangements with dark forces in the Eastern Territories. Kyle's mind reeled. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Not just corruption, but active collaboration with enemies of the realm. Thousands had died because of these schemes. We have to stop this, he said, his voice hard with resolve. We? Lyra raised an eyebrow. A few hours ago you were ready to drag me back to the palace in chains. A few hours ago I thought I was serving my kingdom. Now I know I'm the only one who can truly save it. He squeezed her hand. If you'll have me. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the Forgotten Lodge, 2 fugitives began planning a revolution. The abandoned mining cabin sat like a forgotten relic against the mountainside, its weathered logs barely distinguishable from the rocky outcrop behind it. Kyle pushed open the creaking door, his muscles protesting as he carried Lyra's unconscious form across the threshold. The interior smelled of old wood and dust, but it was mercifully dry and offered shelter from the wind that had begun to howl through the peaks. He laid her gently on the single cot in the corner, noting how pale she'd become during their trek up the mountain. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and when he pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, her skin felt feverish. The wound on her shoulder had reopened during their escape, seeping crimson through the makeshift bandages. Kyle surveyed their meager surroundings. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney promising warmth if he could find fuel. Rough-hewn shelves held a few forgotten supplies, rope, a rusted pot, some mouldy grain that mice had long since claimed. In the corner, a pile of old mining tools gathered dust like abandoned dreams. He stepped back outside, gathering armfuls of dead-fallen pine branches. The sun was already sinking toward the western peaks, painting the snow in shades of amber and rose. Soon it would be dark, and the temperature would plummet. Without fire, they wouldn't survive the night. As flames began to crackle in the hearth, Kyle allowed himself a moment to truly absorb what he'd done. By now, Captain Thorne would have discovered their absence. Search parties would be forming, tracking dogs prepared. His fellow guards would be asking questions he wasn't there to answer. Every hour that passed made him more of a traitor in their eyes, more of an enemy to the crown he'd sworn to serve. But when he looked at Lyra, curled on the cot with firelight dancing across her features, he felt no regret. Only a bone-deep certainty that this was where he belonged, whatever the cost. The dreams are getting worse. Her voice startled him. He turned to find her eyes open, reflecting the orange glow of the fire. She struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her injured shoulder. "You should rest," he said, moving to her side. "You've lost blood, and—" "I can see them dying, Kyle." Her words cut through his concern like a blade. "In the dreams I watch my people suffer while I hide in the mountains, villages burning, children crying for parents who will never come home. Is this what freedom costs, the destruction of everything I was born to protect?" The anguish in her voice made his chest tighten. He sat on the edge of the cot, careful not to jostle her. "Tell me about the dreams. When did they start?" "The night before you found me at the depot." She pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "At first, I thought they were just nightmares born from guilt, but they feel different, more real, like I'm seeing something that's already happening or will happen soon." Kyle frowned. "Your mother mentioned you'd shown signs of the sight when you were younger, prophetic dreams that came true. She tried to have it trained out of me, said it was too dangerous, that seeing the future would only bring madness." Lyra's laugh held no humor. Maybe she was right. Maybe this is what madness feels like, being torn between what you want and what you're meant to do. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's wooden walls. Kyle rose to add more wood to the fire, using the movement to hide his own turmoil. He'd been a soldier long enough to recognize the weight of impossible choices, but this felt different, personal in a way that terrified him. "What if we're both wrong?" he said finally. "What if running isn't the answer, and neither is forcing you into that marriage? Then what? We fight, not by hiding, but by changing things from within. You're still a princess, Lyra. Your people would follow you if you gave them something to believe in besides fear and duty." She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "My father would never listen. He sees strength only in control, unity only in submission. And Prince Victor," she shuddered, "the things I've heard about what he does to those who displease him. If I marry him, I become complicit in that cruelty. Then, we make sure you never have to." The certainty in his own voice surprised him. Somewhere in the space between finding her collapsed in the snow and carrying her to safety, his path had crystallized. Not the rigid adherence to orders he'd known all his life, but something deeper, a loyalty that transcended kingdoms and crowns. Lyra met his gaze across the firelight, and he saw his own resolve reflected there. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. The abandoned watchtower stood like a broken tooth against the storm-darkened sky, its crumbling stones offering the only shelter for miles. Elara pressed her back against the cold wall, watching Kyle pace the small circular room like a caged wolf. Ice crystals had formed in his dark hair, and his breath came out in sharp puffs as he muttered calculations under his breath. 3 days behind schedule," he said, more to himself than to her. "The mountain passes will be worse now. If we'd stayed on the main road, we'd be in chains by now." Elara pulled her stolen cloak tighter around her shoulders. Through the narrow window she could see nothing but swirling white. The blizzard had struck without warning, forcing them to abandon their horses and seek refuge in the ruins. "You know they're tracking us." Kyle stopped pacing and fixed her with that penetrating stare that still made her heart skip. Captain Thorne isn't just tracking us, Princess. He's hunting us. There's a difference. The way he said her title sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold. 3 weeks ago he'd used it with reverence, with duty. Now it carried the weight of everything they'd lost and everything they stood to lose. "You could still go back," she whispered. "Tell them I escaped while you were unconscious, that I used some kind of sleeping draught. They'd believe it." His laugh was bitter. "Would they? When half the Royal Guard saw me carry you out of that depot, when I left no trail, no sign of struggle?" He shook his head. "No, Ilara. We passed the point of no return the moment I chose to save your life instead of delivering you to your father." The storm howled through the broken roof, sending snow spiraling down around them. Ilara watched the flakes melt on her skin and tried to ignore the way her name sounded when he said it. Not Your Highness or Princess, but simply Ilara, as if she were just a woman and he were just a man, instead of a traitor and the prize he'd refused to claim. "Tell me about Valdris," she said suddenly, desperate to break the tension crackling between them. "About the rebellion. Is it true what they say about Prince Marcus?" Kyle settled against the opposite wall, careful to keep distance between them. The small space felt both intimate and vast, with unspoken words hanging in the air. "Marcus is everything your brother isn't," he said finally. "He listens to his people instead of his advisors. He's fought beside his soldiers instead of sending them to die for his ambitions." His voice dropped. "He's also why my sister died." Ilara's breath caught. In all their nights camping under stars, all their whispered conversations by dying fires, he'd never mentioned a sister. "The siege of Moravan," Kyle continued, his eyes distant. "Marcus's forces held the city for 6 months. The people inside, they were starving. My sister was a healer, tried to help the civilians your father sent to break the blockade." His hands clenched into fists. "She died when Marcus finally surrendered the city, trampled in the chaos." "Kyle," Ilara started to reach for him, then stopped herself. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "Why would you? The Crown doesn't keep records of dead healers." The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. "But that's not why I'm helping you escape your engagement." She waited, heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm helping you because the woman who collapsed in that train depot, half frozen and desperate, she reminded me that even princesses can suffer." His grey eyes found hers across the small space, "and because, somewhere between carrying you to safety and watching you choose freedom over a crown, I stopped seeing my duty and started seeing you." The words hung between them like a bridge neither dared cross. Outside, the wind screamed through the mountain peaks, but inside the ruined tower, Ilara could hear nothing but the thundering of her own pulse. "When we reach Valdris," she said carefully, "what happens then?" "You'll be safe. Marcus will grant you sanctuary, protection from your father's reach." Kyle's voice was steady, but she caught the slight tremor beneath. "You'll be free to live whatever life you choose. And you?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the storm. "I'll be a man without a country, without honor, without purpose." His smile was sad and beautiful and heartbreaking. "But for the first time in my life, I'll be a man who chose love over duty." The word hung between them. Love, fragile and terrifying and true. As the blizzard raged around their shelter, Ilara realized that sometimes the most dangerous revolutions began not with armies or declarations, but with a single quiet moment when two hearts decided that some things were worth more than kingdoms. The abandoned watchtower rose from the mountainside like a broken tooth against the storm-darkened sky. Kyle helped Lyra from her horse, noting how she favored her left side where the crossbow bolt had grazed her ribs 3 days prior. They had been riding hard since dawn, following goat paths and deer trails that wound ever higher into the Northlands. "This will have to do," Kyle said, surveying the crumbling structure. Wind howled through gaps in the stone walls, but it would shelter them from the worst of the approaching blizzard. "I'll see if there's anything useful inside." Lyra pulled her cloak tighter and followed him through the doorway. The tower's interior was sparse, rotting timber, scattered bones from some long-dead animal, and a rusted brazier that might still hold a fire. But it was dry, and after sleeping rough for days, even these bare walls felt like luxury. "How far to the border?" she asked, settling gingerly onto a fallen stone. Kyle consulted the map he'd stolen from the garrison. 2 days hard riding, if the weather holds. He looked up at the darkening sky through a gap in the ceiling, which it won't. As if summoned by his words, the first fat snowflakes began to drift down. Within minutes, the gentle fall had become a driving curtain of white that reduced the world to mere feet beyond the tower walls. "Perfect," Lyra muttered, then immediately regretted the complaint. Kyle had sacrificed everything for her, his position, his honor, probably his life if they were caught. The least she could do was bear their hardships with grace. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean—" "You have nothing to apologize for." Kyle was gathering the driest timber he could find. "You didn't ask for any of this." But that wasn't entirely true, was it? She had kissed him in that chapel. She had chosen to trust him with her plans, her fears, her heart. Whatever came next, she bore equal responsibility. "Tell me about the free cities," she said, wanting to fill the silence with something other than the wind's mournful howl. "What will we do there?" Kyle paused in his work, a shadow crossing his features. "I have contacts in Valethorn, mercenary companies that don't ask questions about a man's past," he resumed, stacking wood. "As for you, we'll find you passage to somewhere safe, somewhere your father's reach doesn't extend." Something cold settled in Lyra's stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. "You speak as if we're going to separate." "You're a princess, Lyra. I'm a disgraced guard with nothing to offer but a sword and the enemies we've made getting this far." He struck flint to tinder with more force than necessary. "Once you're safe—" "Safe?" She stood despite the pain in her ribs. "You think I'll be safe anywhere without you? You think I want to be?" The tinder caught, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Kyle fed the tiny flame carefully, not meeting her eyes. "You'll have your freedom. You can choose your own path." "I am choosing." Her voice cracked with frustration. "I'm choosing you, you stubborn fool. I'm choosing this life, hard as it is, over the golden cage they want to put me in." He looked up then, firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. "Lyra, do you love me?" The question hung in the air between them like a blade. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackling fire and the storm's fury outside. When Kyle finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "More than my own life." "Then stop trying to save me from my own choices." She knelt beside him, taking his scarred hands in hers. "We're in this together, whatever comes." He searched her face as if memorizing every detail. "Your father will never stop hunting us. We'll always be looking over our shoulders. Then we'll face that together too." Something shifted in his expression, the last wall crumbling. He pulled her close, mindful of her injury, and she felt the tremor that ran through him. "I don't deserve you," he whispered against her hair. "Good thing that's not your decision to make." Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, but within their small circle of firelight, Lyra felt something she hadn't known in years: true peace. Not the artificial calm of palace life, but the deep contentment that came from being exactly where she belonged. They would reach the border soon, if the weather permitted. Cross into lands where her father's authority meant nothing. Start new lives with new names, and perhaps someday, when enough years had passed, they might even know true safety. But for now, it was enough to sit beside the fire with Kyle's arm around her, watching snow fill the world beyond their shelter. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. Tonight, they had each other, and that felt like victory enough. The abandoned watchtower stood like a broken tooth against the storm-darkened sky, its crumbling stones offering meager shelter from the howling wind. Kyle kicked through the rotted wooden door, his arms burning from carrying Lyra the final mile up the treacherous mountain path. Her fever had worsened during their climb, and now she hung limp and burning in his embrace. Just a little further, he whispered, though she couldn't hear him above her delirious murmurs about shadows and burning crowns. The tower's interior was barely better than the storm outside. Ancient timbers groaned overhead, and snow had drifted through gaps in the stonework, but it was dry enough. Kyle laid Lyra on his travel cloak near the far wall, then set about gathering the scattered debris into a pile for a fire. His hands shook as he struck flint to tinder, not from cold, but from the weight of what he'd done. 3 days had passed since they'd fled the depot. 3 days since he'd chosen her over everything he'd sworn to protect. The kindling caught, casting dancing shadows on the walls. In the flickering light, Lyra looked even more fragile, her skin pale as winter moonlight except for the fever flush across her cheeks. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her breathing came in shallow, rapid bursts. Kyle knelt beside her, pressing the back of his hand to her forehead. The heat radiating from her skin made him curse under his breath. Whatever poison the Shadow Court had used, it was winning. "The trees," Lyra mumbled, her eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids. "They're burning. Father, the trees are burning." He'd heard fragments of her dreams for days now, visions of destruction, of shadow creatures pouring through dimensional rifts, of her homeland consumed by otherworldly fire. Each fevered word confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. Her flight from the palace hadn't been mere rebellion. She'd seen something, known something. A sharp whistle cut through the wind outside. Then another, closer. Kyle's blood turned to ice. He recognized those signals, Royal Guard communication patterns. Captain Thorne's men had found them. Moving with practiced silence, he drew his sword and pressed himself against the wall beside the door. Through a gap in the stones, he could see torchlight flickering up the mountain path. At least 6 men, maybe more. They'd surrounded the tower. "Kyle Ashford!" Thorne's voice boomed across the wind. "I know you're in there. Come out, and we'll make this quick." Behind him, Lyra stirred restlessly, her fevered murmurs growing louder. Any moment, she might cry out and give away their exact position. "You've got 10 seconds, boy," Thorne called. "Then we come in, and the princess might get hurt in the confusion." The threat hit Kyle like a physical blow. He looked back at Lyra, so vulnerable in her sickness, then at the crumbling walls around them. They were trapped. 6 trained guards against 1 man protecting a dying woman. There was no scenario where they both survived a fight, unless... The thought struck him with terrible clarity. He'd spent years studying the old watchtowers during his training. This one sat directly above the Thornwick Gorge, where winter avalanches had carved the mountain into a maze of unstable ledges and snow-heavy overhangs. One well-placed strike, one calculated collapse. 5 seconds, Ashford. Kyle sheathed his sword and gathered Lyra into his arms. She felt impossibly light, as if the fever was burning her away from the inside. Her eyes fluttered open, focusing on him with effort. "Kyle?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "They found us." "Trust me," he said, carrying her toward the tower's rear wall, where a narrow window overlooked the gorge. Below, he could see the pale ribbon of the old mining road that switched back down the mountain face. It was a 100-foot drop to the first ledge, with snow piled deep enough to break their fall if they landed right. What are you?" Lyra's question was cut off as the tower door exploded inward. Thorne charged through with 3 men behind him, weapons drawn. "Surrender the princess, traitor!" Kyle balanced on the window ledge, holding Lyra tight against his chest. "Tell King Aldrich," he called over the wind. His daughter was trying to save the kingdom, not destroy it. Thorne's eyes widened as he realized what Kyle meant to do. "Don't be a fool. You'll both die. Better than letting her die in a dungeon while shadow demons burn the realm." For a moment, everything suspended. The storm, the standoff, even Lyra's labored breathing. Then Kyle saw understanding dawn in her fevered eyes. She pressed her palm against his chest, over his heart. "Together," she whispered. Thorne lunged forward with a desperate shout. Kyle stepped backward into empty air. The wind caught them immediately, spinning them into the white void of the storm. Below, the mountain rushed up to meet them, unforgiving stone and merciful snow waiting in equal measure. The abandoned watchtower stood like a broken tooth against the storm-darkened sky, its crumbling stones offering meager shelter from the howling wind. Elara pressed herself against the wall, listening to the distant thunder of hoofbeats growing closer with each passing moment. Her father's soldiers had tracked them faster than she'd anticipated. "They're less than a mile behind us," Kieran whispered, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Ice crystals had formed in his dark hair, and his usually warm brown eyes held a grim determination that made her chest tighten with fear, not for herself, but for him. "You should go," she said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. "There's still time. If they find you with me—" "Elara!" His voice cut through her panic like a blade. "We've had this conversation." She wanted to argue, to push him away for his own safety, but the sound of approaching voices silenced her protests. Through a gap in the stone wall, she could see torches flickering in the distance like malevolent stars. Kieran moved to the tower's entrance, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "There's another way out through the back," he murmured. "When I give the signal, I'm not leaving you to face them alone." "Princess," he caught himself, jaw clenching. Even now, after everything they'd shared, the weight of who she was and who he was supposed to be created, a chasm between them that duty had carved deep. The hoofbeats stopped. Silence stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the wind's mournful song through the tower's gaps. Then came a voice that made Elara's blood turn to ice. "Sir Kieran of House Blackwood." Commander Aldrich's tone carried the authority of decades spent in service to the crown. "We know you're here. Come out, and we can discuss this civilly." Kieran's mouth curved in a bitter smile. "Civilly," he repeated under his breath, "as if there's anything civil about what they'll do to us." Elara reached for him, her fingers finding his free hand. His skin was cold, but his grip was steady and strong. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "I don't regret it. Any of it. Don't talk like this is over." But she could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was already measuring odds and finding them wanting. "There's still—" "Kieran." Aldrich's voice was closer now, just outside the tower. "I served with your father. I held you when you were a boy of 5 and declared you'd be the finest knight in the realm. Don't make me hunt you like a common criminal." The appeal hit its mark. Elara saw Kieran flinch as if struck. She knew how deeply his honor ran, how the betrayal of his oath was eating him alive even as he chose it again and again. For her. "Stay hidden," he said, releasing her hand. "Whatever you hear, stay hidden." "No." She stepped in front of him, blocking his path to the entrance. "We do this together, or not at all." "Elara, please." "I said no." She lifted her chin, and for a moment she was every inch the princess she'd been born to be. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me. Not again." Before he could protest further, she stepped into the doorway. The wind immediately attacked her, whipping her hair around her face and cutting through her traveling cloak like it was made of silk instead of wool. 12 riders sat mounted in the snow, their horses' breath creating a fog bank between them. Commander Aldrich sat at their head, his weathered face etched with something that might have been regret. When he saw her, he dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "Your Highness." His bow was precise, respectful. "Your father is beside himself with worry." "My father is beside himself with rage that I defied him," she corrected, aware of Kieran moving to stand beside her. Several of the mounted soldiers tensed, hands drifting to weapons, but Aldrich held up a restraining hand. "Perhaps," the commander allowed, "but worry as well. The kingdom needs you, princess. These are dark times, and the alliance with Valorith, the alliance that requires me to marry a man who sees women as property, that treats magic users like animals to be caged." She felt power stirring beneath her skin, responding to her emotions. Ice began to form at her feet, spreading outward in delicate patterns. "I've seen what Valorith does to people like me, Commander. I won't be complicit in it." Several horses shied away from the growing ice, and she saw recognition dawn in Aldrich's eyes. Of course, he'd suspected what she was. Perhaps had even helped cover for her smaller displays of power over the years. "Princess," he said carefully, "please, there has to be another way." "There is." She stepped forward, Kieran matching her stride for stride. "Let us go." Aldrich's hand moved to his sword, and Alara felt the world balance on a knife's edge of possibility and ruin. The ancient library beneath the Moonspire Academy held secrets that predated the kingdom itself. Dust motes danced in shafts of silver light filtering through crystalline windows as Lirale traced her fingers along weathered tome spines, searching for answers that might save them all. The musty scent of parchment and forgotten knowledge filled her lungs with each careful breath. Kyle stood guard at the entrance, his hand resting on his sword hilt as footsteps echoed somewhere in the corridors above. They had perhaps an hour before the Academy's morning routines began, and their sanctuary would be compromised. The irony wasn't lost on him. A royal guard protecting a princess from her own kingdom's forces while she committed what many would consider scholarly treason. "Here," Lirale whispered, pulling a leather-bound volume from a high shelf. The book's cover bore the ancient seal of the First Court, its silver inlay tarnished black with age. The Chronicles of the Void binding. She spread the tome across a reading table, its pages crackling like autumn leaves. The text was written in Old Valeric, a language she'd studied in secret against her tutor's wishes. How many times had her father scolded her for pursuing unnecessary learning when she should have been focused on diplomatic etiquette and marriage prospects? Kyle moved closer, his warmth a comfort against the library's chill. "What does it say?" "The Shadowmere isn't just a plague," she murmured, translating as she read. "It's a consequence. When the first kings bound the elemental forces to create the kingdom's protective barriers, they created an imbalance. The Shadow Realm began bleeding through at the weakest points." Her finger traced ancient diagrams showing ley lines converging beneath the capital. The same ley lines that powered the royal palace's defensive enchantments. The same lines that were now corrupted, feeding the Shadowmere's growth. "There's more," she continued, turning pages with trembling hands. The binding was meant to be temporary, renewed every 3 generations through a ritual of willing sacrifice. But the knowledge was suppressed, hidden away to protect the crown's power. Kyle's jaw tightened. "Your father knew?" "Not just him. Every ruler for the past 2 centuries. The weight of generational betrayal pressed down on her shoulders. They chose to maintain power rather than honor the ancient compact. And now the price is coming due." A crash echoed from somewhere above, followed by shouting voices. Kyle tensed, but the sounds faded as the searchers moved to another section of the academy. They were running out of time. Lirale flipped through more pages, desperate to find the solution she knew had to exist. Her ancestors weren't fools. They wouldn't have created a problem without providing a remedy. Finally, near the book's end, she found what she sought. "The ritual of unbinding," she read aloud. "To break the corrupted chains and restore the natural balance, the blood of the covenant must willingly renounce its claim. The heir must choose the kingdom's true need over inherited power." The words hung heavy in the dusty air. Kyle understood immediately what she was reading. The ancient ritual required her to permanently renounce her royal birthright, severing the magical bonds that tied her bloodline to the throne. It would save the kingdom, but cost her everything she'd been born to inherit. "There has to be another way," Kyle said softly. Lirale closed the book with deliberate care, her decision crystallizing like ice forming on a winter lake. "This is why I ran, Kyle. Some part of me always knew it would come to this choice. Stay and watch my kingdom die slowly, or find the courage to sacrifice what I thought I wanted for what my people actually need." She stood and walked to one of the crystalline windows, gazing out at the academy grounds where morning frost sparkled like scattered diamonds. In the distance, smoke still rose from sections of the capital where the Shadowmere had taken hold. "When I was a child," she said, "I used to dream about being a normal girl. No crown, no expectations, no weight of destiny crushing down on everything I touched. I thought running away would give me that freedom. Kyle joined her at the window. And now? Now I understand that true freedom isn't about escaping responsibility. It's about choosing which responsibilities matter most. She turned to face him, and he saw steel in her eyes that reminded him exactly why he'd fallen in love with her fierce spirit. The ritual must be performed at the convergence point beneath the palace. We'll need to get past your former brothers-in-arms, infiltrate the most heavily guarded location in the kingdom, and somehow convince the court mages to help us perform a ceremony that will strip me of royal power forever. Kyle smiled grimly. I've had easier assignments. Are you certain you want to see this through? Once we begin, there's no going back for either of us. He took her hand, intertwining their fingers. I chose you over duty once already, Princess. That choice becomes easier, not harder, each time I make it. The ancient stones of the Whispering Citadel hummed with power as Princess Lirale pressed her palms against the central altar. The relic chamber stretched high above them, its crystalline ceiling catching starlight that filtered down in ethereal beams. Captain Thane stood guard at the entrance, his sword drawn, listening for the approaching footsteps they both knew would come. The binding ritual requires blood from the royal line, Lirale whispered, her voice echoing off the marble walls. She withdrew a ceremonial dagger from the altar's hidden compartment, its blade gleaming with runes that seemed to shift and dance in the dim light. My ancestors built this place as a failsafe, should the kingdom ever face destruction from within. Thane's jaw tightened as he watched her. 3 days had passed since they'd fled the capital, 3 days of riding hard through mountain passes and forgotten paths to reach this sacred place. Below in the valleys, he could see the smoke rising from burning villages as Prince Aldrich's corrupted forces spread their dark influence like a plague across the land. There has to be another way, he said, though they both knew there wasn't. They'd exhausted every option, followed every lead. The ancient magic sleeping within these walls was their last hope of stopping Aldrich's supernatural army. Lirale's hand trembled slightly as she raised the dagger. The ritual will either bind the dark forces he's unleashed or consume me in the process. The texts aren't clear about which. She met his eyes across the chamber. If something happens to me, nothing will happen to you. Thane's voice was fierce with determination. I won't allow it. A bitter smile crossed her lips. You can't protect me from this, my loyal captain. Some battles must be fought alone. The sound of metal on stone echoed from the corridor beyond. Their pursuers had found them at last. Thane moved closer to the altar, positioning himself between Lirale and the entrance. Through the archway, torchlight flickered as armored figures approached. Princess Lirale! The voice belonged to Commander Varric, Thane's former superior. By order of Prince Aldrich, you will surrender yourself immediately. Your treasonous flight ends here. Lirale began to chant in the old tongue, her words weaving through the air like silver threads. The altar responded, its surface beginning to glow within a fire. Ancient symbols carved into the stone blazed to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Stand down, Thane, Varric called out as he and a dozen soldiers filled the doorway. You've allowed sentiment to cloud your judgment. Step away from the traitor princess. Thane's grip tightened on his sword hilt. These men had been his brothers in arms for years, but now their eyes held an unnatural gleam, the same corruption he'd seen spreading through the capital. Aldrich's influence had reached even here. The only traitor is the prince you serve, Thane replied. Open your eyes, Varric. Look at what he's done to the kingdom. The commander's laugh was hollow, wrong. Prince Aldrich has shown us true power. The old ways are crumbling and a new order rises. Join us willingly and your death will be quick. Behind Thane, Lirale's chanting grew stronger. Wind that shouldn't exist in this sealed chamber began to swirl around the altar. Her hair whipped about her face as she drew the dagger across her palm, letting her blood fall onto the glowing stones. The reaction was immediate and violent. Light exploded outward from the altar, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. The very air seemed to sing with power as the ancient magic awakened fully. Through the brilliant radiance, Thane could see Lirale lifted slightly off the ground, her form becoming translucent as the ritual consumed her. "Now!" Varric shouted, and his soldiers charged. Thane met them at the chamber's center, his blade singing as it caught the magical light. Steel rang against steel as he fought with desperate precision, knowing that every moment he bought might be crucial for Lirale's ritual. A sword thrust past his guard, opening a line of fire across his ribs, but he spun away and struck back, his opponent falling with a cry. The air grew thick and strange. Through the melee he could hear Lirale's voice rising to a crescendo, the ancient words of binding echoing with power that made the stones themselves tremble. Her blood had traced glowing patterns across the altar's surface, creating a web of light that pulsed with each heartbeat. Suddenly, the magical radiance shifted from white to deep crimson. Lirale's scream of pain cut through the clash of battle like a knife. Thane glanced back to see her collapsing, the dagger falling from nerveless fingers as the binding magic turned on its caster. Lirale! He broke away from combat, ignoring the blade that sliced across his shoulder as he reached for her. But even as his hands closed around her falling form, he could feel the terrible heat of the magic burning between them. The ritual was completing itself, drawing its power not just from royal blood, but from royal life. The ancient chamber beneath the palace hummed with an energy that made Lyra's teeth ache. Crystalline formations jutted from the walls like frozen lightning, each one pulsing with the same sickly light that had been consuming the kingdom above. At the center of it all sat the heart of Valdris, a massive gem the size of a person, its faceted surface reflecting their torchlight in fractured rainbows. "It's dying," Lyra whispered, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The artifact that had protected their realm for 1,000 years was cracking, dark fissures spreading across its surface like spider webs. Kael moved beside her, his armor clanking softly in the oppressive silence. The texts spoke of this. When the bloodline weakens, when the royal magic fails, when a princess runs away from her destiny, Lyra finished bitterly. She could feel the pull of the heart now, a magnetic force that seemed to reach into her very bones. "I caused this, didn't I? By leaving, by refusing the binding ceremony." Behind them, Captain Thorne's voice carried across the cavern as he positioned his men at the entrance. They had perhaps an hour before Queen Morwen's forces would breach the hidden passages, an hour to either save the kingdom or watch it crumble into the void. "Your mother lied to you," Kael said quietly. "The binding ceremony, it's not a marriage contract. It's a blood sacrifice." Lyra's heart lurched. "What?" "I found the true records in the vault. The heart doesn't just need royal blood to sustain it. It needs a royal life. Every generation, when the magic weakens, a member of the royal family must give themselves to the gem completely. Their essence becomes part of it, renewing its power." His jaw tightened. "Your mother has been searching for a way around it for years. She thought if she could bind you to someone with magical ability, perhaps the sacrifice could be shared, lessened." The revelation hit Lyra like a physical blow. All those years of preparation, of being told about her duty to marry for the kingdom's sake, it had all been a desperate mother's attempt to save her daughter's life. "She was trying to protect me," Lyra breathed, "and doom someone else in the process." Kael's hand found hers in the darkness, but there might be another way. Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of marching feet echoed from the tunnels above. Queen Morwen had arrived. "Princess Lyra!" Her mother's voice carried down through the stone, amplified by magic until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I know you're down there. Come up, and we can discuss this reasonably. The kingdom needs you." Lyra looked at the cracking heart, then at Kael's determined face. "What other way?" "The records mention a ritual performed only once before, during the War of Shadows. Two people, bonded by choice rather than blood, can share the burden, but it requires perfect trust, perfect unity." His eyes met hers, "and it still might kill us both." The cavern shuddered, as magic pressed against the ancient wards protecting this place. Her mother was trying to force her way down, and the barriers wouldn't hold much longer. "Even if we survive the ritual," Lyra said, "my mother will never forgive this betrayal. We'll be fugitives forever. Some things are worth running for." Kyle's thumb traced across her knuckles. "But this time, we run toward something instead of away." Another tremor shook the chamber, and several of the crystalline formations cracked. The heart's light flickered, like a candle in the wind. Lyra closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 1,000 years of royal duty pressing down on her shoulders. But beneath that weight, she felt something else. The steady warmth of Kyle's hand in hers, the knowledge that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. "Tell me what we need to do," she said. Kyle pulled an ancient tome from his pack, its pages brittle with age. "We place our hands on the heart together and speak the words of binding. Our life forces will merge temporarily with the gem's matrix, hopefully stabilizing it without requiring a permanent sacrifice." Hopefully. A grim smile touched his lips. The scholar who wrote this didn't survive to record whether it actually worked. The wards above them cracked with a sound like thunder, and golden light began to seep through the ceiling. Queen Morwen was almost through. Lyra squared her shoulders and walked toward the dying heart of Valdris. Its fractured surface reflected her approach in a dozen different angles, showing her all the possible versions of herself: the dutiful princess, the rebellious daughter, the frightened girl, the woman ready to fight for love. "Together then," she said, placing her palm against the cold crystal. Kyle joined her, his hand covering hers against the gem's surface. The heart pulsed once, recognizing the touch of royal blood and chosen love combined. They began to speak the ancient words as the chamber filled with blinding light. The ancient stones of the Shadowmere citadel trembled as Ilara pressed her palms against the crystalline heart of the binding ritual. Power coursed through her veins like liquid starlight, each pulse threatening to tear her apart from within. Around her, the accumulated magic of centuries writhed in desperate rebellion, seeking any crack in her resolve to exploit. "I can't hold it much longer," she gasped, blood trickling from her nose as the overwhelming force pushed against every barrier she'd erected in her mind. Kyle fought his way through the swirling maelstrom of energy, his sword cutting through tendrils of corrupted magic that lashed out like living things. Each step toward her felt like walking through molten glass, but he pressed on, his eyes never leaving her trembling form. "You don't have to do this alone," he shouted over the roar of unleashed power. "Remember what we discovered in the archives. The binding was never meant for one person." Behind them, the sound of splintering stone announced their pursuers. Lord Commander Varric burst through the chamber's massive doors, his face a mask of fury and desperation. The remaining Royal Guard spread out behind him, their weapons drawn but useless against the magical forces rampaging through the ancient chamber. "Princess!" Varric's voice cracked with emotion. "Step away from the crystal. Your father—" "My father is dead," Ilara replied, her voice carrying a terrible finality that silenced even the howling magic around them. "The corruption took him 3 days ago. I felt it through our blood bond, the moment his mind shattered. The revelation hit the assembled guards like a physical blow. Several dropped to their knees, overwhelmed by grief and the sudden understanding of what this moment truly meant. Without a ruling monarch, the kingdom would fall to chaos within hours of the binding's collapse." Kyle reached her side, his hand covering hers on the crystal's surface. Immediately the violent energy stabilized, drawn to their combined will like a river finding its proper channel. The relief in Ilara's eyes was worth every oath he'd broken to reach this moment. "The Royal Codex speaks of dual monarchy," he said, his voice steady despite the impossible forces flowing through them both. "2 hearts, 1 crown, shared burden." "Treason," Varric whispered, but his sword remained lowered. Around him, his men exchanged uncertain glances. They could all feel it now, the way the magic responded to the pair's joined strength, how the chaotic maelstrom was slowly transforming into something controllable, purposeful. "Is it treason to save the kingdom?" Elara asked, turning to face her father's most loyal servant while maintaining her grip on the crystal. The power no longer fought her. Instead, it flowed through both her and Kael like a great river finally freed from a broken dam. Or is treason allowing it to fall because we're too afraid to abandon traditions that no longer serve? The crystal pulsed, and suddenly everyone in the chamber could see what she saw. Visions of the kingdom's possible futures spreading out like branches of an infinite tree. In one, the binding collapsed entirely, plunging the land into an age of darkness where twisted creatures roamed freely and civilization crumbled. In another, the magic transformed, becoming something new and vibrant, fed by the willing partnership of two souls who had chosen each other over duty, over fear, over the easy path of blind obedience. The prophecy one of the younger guards breathed, the one about the princess who would forge a new age. "It was never about her ruling alone," Varric said slowly, understanding dawning in his weathered features. "It was about her choosing to share power, to transform the very nature of monarchy itself." The crystal's light intensified, and Elara felt the binding structure shifting beneath her consciousness. What had been a prison for the kingdom's wild magic was becoming something unprecedented, a symbiotic relationship where power flowed freely but remained guided by wisdom and love rather than force and tradition. "Together," Kael said softly, and she nodded. They spoke the words simultaneously, their voices harmonizing in the ancient tongue. "By blood and choice, by love and sacrifice, we bind ourselves to this realm and its people, not as masters but as guardians, not as rulers but as servants of something greater than ourselves." The transformation began slowly, like dawn breaking over snow-covered mountains. The crystal's harsh edges softened, becoming something organic and alive. The oppressive weight of centuries-old magic lifted, replaced by something that sang rather than screamed, that invited participation rather than demanding submission. Throughout the kingdom, people stopped in their daily tasks as they felt the change, a lifting of a burden they hadn't even realized they'd been carrying, a sudden sense of possibility where before there had been only resignation to ancient patterns. In the Shadowmere Citadel, Princess Elara and the Royal Guard who had chosen love over duty stood hand in hand before the transformed heart of their kingdom, no longer bound by the old ways, but free to write a new story entirely. The revolution had begun not with swords or proclamations, but with two people brave enough to believe that love could indeed conquer all, even destiny itself. The crystalline walls of the ice citadel trembled as another wave of dark magic crashed against its ancient barriers. Elara pressed her palm against the central pillar, feeling the raw power of the kingdom's heart pulsing beneath her fingertips like a wounded bird. The corruption was spreading faster now, black veins snaking through the translucent stone that had protected her people for 1,000 years. "The binding won't hold much longer," she whispered, her breath forming clouds in the rapidly cooling air. Outside, she could hear the howling of shadow beasts as they circled the citadel, drawn by the scent of weakening magic. Kael stood behind her, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, though they both knew steel would be useless against what was coming. There has to be another way. The archives, the old texts. "I've read them all." Elara's voice cracked with exhaustion. They'd been searching for 3 days since fleeing the capital, following the ancient passages that led to this sacred place. The curse can only be broken by willing sacrifice. Royal blood freely given to restore the balance. The words hung between them like a blade. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains, though no natural storm could penetrate this deep into the citadel. The darkness was testing their defenses, probing for weakness. Kael moved closer, his warmth a stark contrast to the growing cold. "Your father's sins aren't yours to pay for, aren't they?" She turned to face him, tears freezing on her cheeks. He bound his bloodline to this magic when he made his bargain with the Shadow Court. Every heir carries that debt. Her fingers traced the obsidian crown that had materialized around her brow the moment she'd entered the chamber. A weight she'd tried so hard to escape now settled upon her like destiny itself. The corruption pulsed again, stronger this time. Cracks appeared in the walls, letting in tendrils of smoke that moved with unnatural purpose. They had minutes, perhaps less. Then we face it together. Kyle's voice was steady, resolved. If royal blood is what's needed... No, the word tore from her throat. You don't understand. The sacrifice has to be willing, and it has to be complete. There's no coming back from this, Kyle. No last-minute reprieve, no clever escape. One of us dies here, or the kingdom falls to shadow. He stepped forward, cupping her face in his hands. Then we'd better make our choice count. For a heartbeat, she let herself lean into his touch, memorizing the warmth of his skin, the steadiness in his dark eyes. This man who had followed her across a continent, who had chosen her over duty, over honor, over everything he'd sworn to protect. The irony wasn't lost on her. In the end, they were both choosing duty after all. I used to dream about running away to somewhere warm, she said softly. Somewhere with golden beaches and fruit trees, where no one would know my name. We'll go there, he promised, though they both knew it was a lie. After this is over. The shadow beast's howls grew closer. The cracks in the walls widened, and she could see glowing eyes peering through the gaps. The ancient magic that protected this place was failing, unraveling like a tapestry pulled apart by invisible hands. Elara pulled away from Kyle's embrace and approached the altar at the chamber's center. The crystalline dagger that lay upon it seemed to hum with anticipation, its blade sharp enough to cut through flesh and spirit alike. She lifted it with trembling hands, feeling its weight, so much heavier than something so small should be. Elara, wait. Kyle's voice was desperate now. Let me do this. I'm the one who failed in my duty, who let you escape in the first place. My blood could work. You're not royal born. She didn't turn around, afraid that looking at him would shatter her resolve. The magic is specific. It has to be me. Then I'll find another way. Give me time. We don't have time. The words echoed off the crumbling walls as another section of the barrier collapsed entirely. Shadow poured through the gap like liquid night, and the temperature plummeted. Look around us, Kyle. This is it. This is how it ends. She raised the dagger, its blade catching the last glimmers of pure light in the chamber. The corruption in the central pillar pulsed eagerly, sensing what was coming. One quick cut, and it would all be over. The curse would break, the shadows would retreat, and her kingdom would be safe. Behind her, she heard the whisper of steel as Kyle drew his sword. Not to stop her, she realized, but to guard her back in these final moments. Even now he was choosing to protect her rather than prevent her sacrifice. The blade trembled in her grip as footsteps echoed from the passages beyond. Not shadow beasts this time, but something far more dangerous. The ancient crown felt impossibly heavy in Lyra's hands as she stood before the assembled court. 3 months had passed since that desperate flight through snow and shadows, 3 months since Kyle had chosen her over his sworn duty. Now, in the golden light of the throne room, those memories seemed like fragments of a fever dream. The nobles whispered among themselves, their voices creating a low hum of uncertainty that filled the vast chamber. Lord Chancellor Theron stepped forward, his weathered face grave as he addressed the crowd. "The princess has returned," he announced, his voice carrying across the stone walls. "She brings with her evidence of Duke Aldrich's treachery and a proposal that will determine the fate of our kingdom." Lyra's eyes found Kyle among the royal guards. He stood at attention, his uniform pristine, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested near his sword. Their gazes met for the briefest moment, and she drew strength from the steady confidence she found there. "Lord Chancellor," Duke Aldrich's voice rang out from the noble section, smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "Surely we cannot trust the word of a runaway princess and her companion. They have been fugitives from royal justice." Murmurs of agreement rippled through some of the assembled nobility, but Lyra stepped forward, her chin raised. The documents they had retrieved from Aldrich's stronghold rustled in her other hand. "Uncle," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite her racing heart, "your own correspondence speaks for itself." She began to read, her voice growing stronger with each damning sentence. Letters detailing plans to assassinate her father, agreements with enemy kingdoms, promises of gold in exchange for strategic positions along their borders. The court fell silent as the scope of Aldrich's betrayal became clear. When she finished, the silence stretched taut as a bowstring. King Aldwin, her father, sat motionless on his throne, his face carved from stone. Lyra had barely recognized him when she first entered. The weeks of her absence had aged him, carved new lines around his eyes and mouth. "These documents," Duke Aldrich sputtered, "they could be forgeries. The girl has had months to—" "Enough!" The king's voice cut through the protests like a blade. He rose slowly, his ceremonial robes flowing around him like shadows. "Captain Kael, step forward." Lyra's breath caught as Kael moved through the crowd, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. He stopped before the throne and went to one knee. "Your Majesty," he said simply. "You were sent to retrieve my daughter," the king continued, his gaze piercing. "Yet you vanished with her for 3 months. Explain yourself." Kael raised his head, meeting the king's stare without flinching. "Your Majesty, I discovered that Princess Lyra's life was in immediate danger. The evidence we've presented today, we nearly died retrieving it, but it was necessary to prove what the princess suspected all along." "And did it never occur to you," the king's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, "to send word, to request backup, to follow protocol?" "It did, Your Majesty." Kael's voice remained steady. "I chose to trust the princess's judgment instead. If I was wrong, then I accept the consequences." The king studied them both for a long moment. Lyra felt the weight of every gaze in the room, the pressure of expectations and traditions that had shaped her entire life. But she also felt something else, a clarity that had been born in those desperate weeks of flight and discovery. "Father," she said, stepping beside Kael, "Captain Kael saved my life. More than that, he helped me save our kingdom. If you must punish someone for the choices made, punish me." "Lyra," Kael started, but she silenced him with a look. "I asked him to trust me," she continued, "to help me find the truth. He could have dragged me back in chains, but instead he listened. He believed in something greater than orders and duty." The king descended the steps of his throne slowly, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. When he reached them, he was quiet for a long moment. "The greatest rulers," he said finally, his voice soft enough that only they could hear, "are those who know when to break the rules." Then, louder, for the court to hear, "Captain Kael, rise." Kael stood, confusion flickering across his features. "You are hereby promoted to Lord Commander of the Royal Guard," the king announced. "And as for you, my daughter," he turned to Lyra, his stern expression softening almost imperceptibly, "it seems you've learned what it truly means to lead." He placed his hands over hers as she held the crown, and together they lifted it. The weight that had seemed so impossible moments before felt different now. Not a burden, but a responsibility she was finally ready to bear. As the court erupted in cheers and Duke Aldrich was led away in chains, Lyra caught Kael's eye once more. This time he smiled.